May we always recognise each other's values and opinions, be fair-minded and ready to listen to each other's point of view. In our dealings with each other, let us always be open to the truth of others and ready to seek agreement, slow to take offence and always prepared to forgive. May we always work to enhance the well-being of Selwyn District and its communities. We will. Welcome back to 2023, first council meeting of the year. I'm going to start by saying thank you for the time this morning where we were in Lincoln. It was great to travel around the township, have a look at how the township functions at the moment, the relationship between the existing business areas, the newer business areas, and the university. And Grant, Deborah and Malcolm, thank you for leading us around there, particularly Grant setting up the university and the commentary on the trip. It was great. At the start of the meeting, when I get into my report, if anyone would like to give any feedback on that this morning, provide space for that to happen as well. Apology from Shane Epiha. I think the rest of us are here. So I'll have that noted. Conflicts of interest that anyone would like to raise that aren't already on the register, Deborah? Just use your microphone, Deborah.
Plan changes 77 and 81 and 82 that are on the agenda.
Okay, thank you. Yeah. Okay.
I think we're all with the plan changes who are doing the hearings. And
anyone else want to highlight that as a conflict? Deborah and Nicole, you'll both step out of the room at that point for the discussion, and Malcolm as well. So 3. Confirmation of minutes is on tab 6. The minutes from the meeting on the 14th of December. A chance to look through those. It's moved Malcolm and seconded Sophie. Is there any discussion on those minutes? Yes, Grant.
Mr. Lilly raised some issues around safety on Whedon's Road, and some of the feedback was around is there opportunities to review the speed limits on a temporary basis to improve safety. Is that going to be a feedback item from staff report? How are we going to address that? Is it
Murray?
It would be unusual to introduce a temporary speed limit for one intersection because of a public forum. There's a lot of intersections that have issues. We are doing the speed management guide work over the next year, which will look at more permanent speed limits.
So what I'm hearing, the next speed limit review will be the appropriate time to do it?
Yes, yes.
Which will be this calendar year?
It'll be commenced this year and it'll be completed by next year. That road, it's now 80k. It took a long time to get down to 80k because of the reluctance of some to get 100k route into town, but it got down to 80k. As the growth developed down Lincoln Road to push it to 60k, I think it will be looked at very favourably in that next review. And that Reed Pit corner and that intersection probably warrant a very much closer look. We do know that the Whedon's Selwyn Road intersection is currently a long way out on the plan, and there's a lot of competing pressures for funding. So at this stage, it'll be probably a long-term plan consideration to that intersection. So yes, we'll look at the speed limit, but I wouldn't want to indicate that we'll be doing temporary speed limits on the fly to some degree.
Thank you. Probably we need to think about how we feed that back to the submitters that have been here, though, so they have an understanding of what's been done with the information they've given to us. So if you could draft something, Murray, that would be helpful. Thank you. Anything else on those minutes? All those in favour of the true and accurate record, say aye. Anyone against? Declare it carried. The public matters under investigations on page 20. There's 3 items on there. David?
Yeah, Mr. Mayor, so we discussed this and the response times at our executive meeting yesterday, and they're all going to be coming back in the March or April meetings of council.
They'll be updated from the February that's at the moment.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Any questions on those matters under investigation or things people thought should be there that aren't listed? Sophie?
The CE's already answered this question, but the Foster House fell off the final report and decision on that fell off the public matters under investigation recently, but that's coming back to March meeting as well.
It's confirmed, yes.
Yeah.
Great. So they'll be added here. So we have that as a record. Anything else? No. My report is on page 21 of the agenda. There's a few things that I've noted in the report that have previously been reported to council, but this is my first report since November, so they're just here in writing for the record. One thing I'll add is that last week we had the Greater Christchurch Partnership meeting of the year. Thanks Nicole and Lydia for coming to that. There'll be consultation in our community over the next month, looking at how our community wants to build and have their say into the Greater Christchurch Partnership, thinking about future transport connections and where we live and how we treat our land. So yeah, there'll be opportunities for people and so on to make sure they have their say there. I don't know, Lydia and Nicole, if there's anything else you'd like to add about the GCP and that first meeting? No? Okay. I'll move that you receive my report then. Thanks, Malcolm. Seconder, I moved it. Yeah, Malcolm seconded. The same thing about the trip this morning.
Sorry, I was going to ask you a question about your report.
Sorry, I was just going to check it there. What's the question?
The question is actually on page 22.
Yeah.
It's looking at the government bills that are under review.
Yes.
One's the natural built environment and the spatial planning, which is on the agenda today.
Yes.
The review for the future of local government, that closes on the 28th of February. Sorry, I was an apology for the meeting on Friday with regards to Ashburton, and I believe this may have been discussed. Will we meet that deadline date of putting in our own submission by the 28th of February as a council?
Yes. And the plan is that following council meeting today, there'll be an update to think about what we might want to say in that submission so it can be drafted for further feedback.
So we're having, basically after today's council meeting, there'll be a equivalent of a workshop.
Yes.
Thank you.
Anything further from that report or from today's visit? All those in favour that you received my report, say aye. Anyone against? Declare it carried. And now move to tab 8, page 26. It's the Chief Executive's report.
Mr. Mayor, councillors, good afternoon. The report, several items I want to refer to. The first one, Rescue Special Fund, and it aligns with recommendation D. It's around the membership of that committee. And in my report, I give some background to the fund itself. Still has $236,000 to distribute. We're about to go into round 5 of applications. There have been some changes in membership, which are necessitated as a result of the outcome from recent elections. I have spoken to those who are departing the committee. So you see the top of page 27. Recommendation is that the membership be the 2 Melbourne Law councillors who I note have already been formally appointed, councillors Medford and Glidden. The 2 not to wear subdivisions is the Hawkins subdivision members of Melbourne Community Board, Ken and Sean Nu'u. 2 previous members of the Darfield Township Committee, Angela Hanrahan, Mandy McCorn, and Rob Lawrence as our independent member. So happy to answer any questions on that. I point out that that committee has been very ably chaired by Councillor Medford for the last year plus, and has given out a considerable amount of money to very, very deserving causes within the Darfield, or the defined Darfield area. Put a line through item 2, that was a wee whoopsie on my part, misinterpreting what the request was. And in fact, what we want to do is appoint Councillor.
I think we already have appointed councillor.
Yeah, just confirming that. Yeah. Yeah, that's it. Thank you very much. The Infometrics update is attached to my report just for the benefit of those who are watching online. Some of the key things that come out of this update for the September 22 year. Selwyn's economy grew by 6.9% over that year. The last quarter slowed down a bit to only 3.5%. Employment, interestingly, has grown by 7.3% in the year to September 2022. Consumer spending, unsurprisingly, has grown very strongly, 17% in the September 2022 quarter. Our population continues to grow strongly, 4.8% in the last year. Number of new consented dwellings over 500, so 517 to be precise, and non-residential construction 335 million in the year to September 2022, and that's across a whole range of buildings across the district. Electrical vehicle charging stations, very pleased to announce 17 new stations are being installed at council sites by Meridian, and these are in car parks in West Melbourne Community Centre, Tennyson Street in Rolleston, Riddleton, Karkaha Park, Lincoln Event Centre and Selwyn Aquatic Centre, forming part of the Zero public network with over 85 charging stations already in operation across the district. And they will join our existing network of stations, which are already in Arthurs Pass, Castle Hill, Dunsandel, Leaston and Lincoln, and that will continue to expand into the future. And the final item, Mr Mayor, is some changes to delegation manual, which reflect recent changes in staff. Happy to answer any questions on any of those items.
Thanks, David. Deborah.
Thank you. Look, just with regards to the electrical vehicle charging stations, it's been brought to my attention the time that it actually takes to recharge and the capacity for everybody to be able to queue or park a vehicle to actually recharge once we have more EVs. And just with regards to time management, how is that going to impact on people actually being able to charge sufficiently, especially for long journeys in an EV, given that, most people would take the vehicle home and charge it at home for the day. But then if you got to recharge at a charging station, how long do you have to stand around or wait or get a cup of coffee or go for a shop and then wait in line for everybody else to do the same? And it's just an issue that I just wonder whether anybody's actually really thought of trying to resolve. I know that overseas this is actually an issue that is evolving with regards to charging stations. So it's the availability, the time taken and the number of charging stations. So I just want to highlight that matter and just say, look, are we addressing that in our rollout?
Yeah, and you're right, it's not a local issue, it's a national issue. And, we're contemplating at Christmas time, just the average length of a trip from Christchurch to Nelson, for example, with the need to recharge on the way. But Kelvin has got some background info on this that answer the question.
Really, really interesting questions I think they're going to puzzle a lot of people. In terms of these charging stations that we're facilitated in the way of providing resources within our car parks. We don't own the infrastructure, we don't manage the infrastructure. Anyone who charges off them needs an account set up in the Zero charging network. So we're really there to putting the equipment in. And I think the key to that is more facilities need to be made available to enable queues to be shorter. And you can now see that energy companies like Z are putting in charging stations in their own forecourts. So the number of charging stations will improve that without doubt, and charging technology will improve over time to be faster charging.
Thank you, Gavin. Elizabeth.
Hi, being an EV owner, I can talk on practical experience. So what I want to know is there an app, whether it's Selwyn related or nationwide, that can allow EV owners to know where all of the different stations are for the different providers and the type of charger, because different chargers come at a different rate of speed for charging. And so that would clarify a lot of what you were saying, because you have to, with an EV, you have to time plan and prepare before every travel. And so also some of the apps will show you if that charging station's already got somebody there, and it would be nice to know whether it can also tell you at which point, sort of a rough indication of where that person's at with their charging. I'm not sure, because I'm very limited in what I drive with my EV, and I just go to the one type of charging station. But yeah, just wanting to clarify that, please.
Yeah, I think you've put your finger on what could be a really profitable solution for someone to design an app for. The challenge with that, there is
that app has already been designed and it's going.
I think the challenge we will find in the future, though, is given a few companies are going to be getting on board this, for them to share that information among themselves will be the key thing, and whether they're willing to share that information will be interesting.
Thank you. I think we've talked enough about the operations of charging facilities. So if there's any other questions about charging, we'll just move on from that.
Just
Sophie?
quick comment. It's just a quick comment that this is one of the reasons why EVs aren't a perfect alternative to ICE vehicles. More public transport and active transport and tow management. It's kind of got to deal with it rather than littering the world with more chargers as well. Thanks.
Okay. Anything else on David's report? Mover and seconder that we receive and approve. Thanks, Malcolm. Seconded. Thanks, Lydia. All those in favour say aye. Anyone against? Declare it carried. The next item is the Chief Executive's report on the Melbourne Community Board delegations.
Mr. Mayor, again, thank you. So as we know statutorily, we are required by resolution to identify delegations to assign to the community board. The delegations deliberately are kept at a very high level to allow discussion and reaction to anything that happens during the 3-year term of governance. In the report, I talk about the statutory roles of community boards and Section 52 of the Local Government Act. Refer to delegations, also identifying those things that cannot be delegated to the board. And that part of this paper has already been discussed with the board at a recent meeting. Over in front of you, pages 47 through 49 is based firstly on the delegations that were previously held by the board and modified by the management team. So we can see that firstly, there are delegated responsibilities in terms of long-term plan and annual plan, particularly making recommendations around priorities for local projects, roading in terms of installation of pedestrian crossings, recommendations on speed limits. Over the page, the resource management plan. More importantly, roles for civil defence, property, parks and reserves, and good example of that is the visit that we've got to Castle Hill in a couple of weeks' time, where we'll be talking to the community, extending to community awards development, and also the UBETSU sister city relationship that the board have. So the purpose of this report, Mr. Mayor, is for council to sign off on the delegations, and that they will then be adopted by the community board at its next scheduled meeting, which is in 10 days' time on a Monday evening.
Great, thanks, David. Any questions on that? Or mover and seconder? Bob move, seconded. Malcolm, thank you. Any discussion? All those in favour, please say aye. Aye. Anyone against? Declare it carried. Thanks, David. The next item is the Joint District Licensing Committee report. It's on page 50 of today's agenda. So are you reporting?
Yeah.
Great.
Right, thanks. Apologies from Malcolm, he's not very well today. It's a very short report for December. December, the DLC tends to shut down for a period of about 4 weeks. I think November was really busy. The only thing of note in the report was the Good Home in Prebbleton opened. Shortly after the new development in Prebbleton, the Little Land store opened. December, January's picked up again. So if anybody's got any questions, feel free to ask.
Any questions from anyone? Mover and seconder to receive the report. Thanks, Phil. Seconded, Lydia. All those in favour say aye. Aye. Anyone against? Declare it carried. Thanks, Phil. Next, we have the council submission to the natural and built environment and spatial planning bill. George, thank you for the work that you have done on this. It's on page 55, tab 11 of today's agenda. George, I'll hand it forward to you if there's things you'd like to say on this report. I'll just note that yesterday I was involved in LGNZ had a briefing to the planning committee and talked through a number of things that from local government's perspective we don't think these bills make particularly clear. And while the objectives of trying to think about how do we have regional plans that provide clarity for people, how we speed up process, how we protect the environment as well as enabling development are admirable, that the current way that things are drafted don't seem to make things clearer or faster. And the removal of decision making from councils to a regional planning committee removes the elected member accountability that currently sits within the current framework as we move into a regional the regional setup. One of the other problems identified is in a regional setup, someone becomes the host council of this. If we're thinking about the Canterbury context, it's most probably Environment Canterbury. But if you have as the host of that work stream, generally the CEO is responsible for all the employment and all the activities that go on within the council. But as we work as a region and there's a more collaborative model going on, not everything that's done with ECAN hosting becomes the responsibility of the CEO of ECAN. So there's a whole lot that's going on in these changes. And George, we appreciate the time you've put in to giving our submission here as well. If you'd like to say anything, I'll hand it forward to you.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Good afternoon, elected members. I think you've covered the big issues with the legislation that's replacing the Resource Management Act. And I think the submission tries to capture some of the issues that the council staff have identified, particularly in terms of local voice, democratic input, and that regional planning committee model. I would preface one thing: the submission does target areas for improvement and the changes we'd like to see, so that this legislation is as workable and successful as it can be if it endures for 30 years like the RMA. There are some good things in there, and I think since you focused on some of the challenges, I might just go over some of the positives since you covered them so well. And I think one of the great things is in the legislation is the shift to outcomes. There's been a clear focus on managing effects in the resource management system, and it is a resource management system, not a planning system where we're getting into the future state we want to see. And I think the transition to an outcomes focused system is a good thing in the legislation. Also, I think elevating the status of Titiriti, giving effect to the principles of Titiriti in a more strategic role for Māori is another thing that's really positive in the legislation. There are quite a few challenges as well that we've already covered, and I think that the submission does focus on some of those challenges, particularly around the structures and the regional planning committee. There are a few things I'd just like to put to members today, which has been kind of debated in the local government sector, or there's been less agreement between various territorial authorities and councils on it, and that's whether the principles of Titiriti need to be codified in the legislation since there's a new requirement to give effect to them, or whether there should just be guidance so it's sufficiently flexible to allow Titiriti to be applied to a contemporary context that evolves over time. Also, the local government sector was looking to have mandatory elected member representation in the regional planning committee, but the sector's input into the Taitura submission, and they shared that recently, and they're looking to leave it open that it could be elected members or appointees. The other point I'd like to raise is how these regional planning committees are to be formulated. There's been some discussion as to whether there should be population proportional representation. In our submission, we don't support that. I would note that by the TAs in the Canterbury region, the Selwyn district has the second largest population, and we are the fourth largest territorial authority by area. That's including the whole of Waitaki, which obviously straddles more than one region. Other than that, I will just take the report as read, and it's rather lengthy submission, so I'm sure there'll be some questions.
Thank you for that, George. Elizabeth.
Hi, I just wanted to say that when I read the submission, I thank you so much. You've done a really good and thorough job on this. But when I read it, there was a huge feeling of how we're looking at centralising and taking away, which you've already noted, from the local democratic situation we have here. And I feel that we would be unfairly representing our area because we're only appointing one person, and that's not necessarily an elected official. It could be appointed per se as a job. So there's multiple areas here which are of grave concern. One is also the ministerial oversight and the ability for them to overrule at any point, and numerous other things. One thing that I'd like to say to the submission is it doesn't clearly state where our position is on the bill. I do not support this bill. I see that there are the odd good thing, but I see more against this bill than I see in favour for the bill. And I feel that this bill is of huge concern to the democracy of New Zealand going forward. And where does the council see itself and its job in the future if this bill is to go ahead? I feel we'll lose what the council really means to the community and what we represent here, and our ability to function in this community as a whole, make decisions for the community. So I would like to have seen at the start of the submission something that says the council does not support this bill at all because for these various following reasons. Thank you.
Thanks, Elizabeth. I think within any piece of legislation, there's always going to be things that we like and dislike about it, and that's the nuance that George has tried to pull through, commenting on the things that we think aren't right, and then also supporting the bits where we think there will be improvement within the system. And that's, as was the LG&Z view as well, that the objectives of the reform seem good and admirable, but actually whether they'll be achieved through the legislation as it is drafted is pretty questionable. And so making sure that our submission highlights on how we can improve it rather than just quitting it and saying, let's just stay as we are.
It's a huge risk, Sam.
Thanks. Sophie?
Yeah, thanks for me also. That's a heap of work that you've been up to. I mean, we all know it's like 900 odd pages worth of bill to read through, and I tried reading through it concurrently with the submission, and oh my God, there's so much detail. Definitely appreciate the comments, the submission clauses that you've made regarding things like urban design and targets and the ministerial overreach, which I guess that speaks to not trusting us or local government, but at the same time, sometimes the commissioner's decisions could potentially come out in a certain way that doesn't achieve other things. It's going to be really interesting to see all the case law that comes out of this because, yay, starting fresh, probably with all of that. And especially the local place plans that you mentioned around, like, instead of statements of expectation. One question that could be for just about anyone in staff, I guess. It mentions that we support the Canterbury Mayoral Forum. It would be great to see that. Haven't actually seen it. I assume that it is full of stuff that we would support, but anyway. There are a couple of clauses when I was reading through it that I know there's probably not an opportunity to add any amendment, but one of them, there was a section on clause 14 that includes things around not of the submission of the MBE. It mentions offset and redress as an option. And that does worry me because that basically suggests that it's possible to buy your way out of adverse effects without actually specifying whether it's actually going to fix whatever issue you're creating. Clause 20, it mentions several times things like the bed of a river. And I really wonder how that would impact us here because we've got braided rivers, like we literally live on an entire floodplain. We already know where flooding tends to happen, but it's still, you can look at historical photos and see that we have literally started building and farming on top of what 50 years ago was part of a floodplain very actively. So I'm kind of worried by the interpretation of that. And the last one I would like to mention was clause 77 on there. It talks about cost recovery, and it mostly talks about costs to applicants and to councils. And I was thinking about how we've been using Friend of the Submitter services recently. So that is a cost sometimes to council, sometimes to MFE or shared. Not quite sure how it's all gone through there. But that is something that I would love to see us continue to do, or whatever the new regional policies might be, committees, but who pays for it, basically? Because we're trying to encourage communities to do that work. And then you get past the original submission stage, and then they potentially want to go to the Environment Court or anything else. And then literally communities kind of left to themselves, and they have no option under this rules for their own cost recovery, even if they win. And we're talking millions sometimes. So that does kind of worry me that it doesn't include that level of community voice. But yeah, those are all my comments. Thank you. Thank you again. But I don't know how, I hope you actually got a summer break as well.
Yeah, thank you. No, I should notice there was a team that helped draft this submission, and being that it's the complete legislative architecture of the new resource management system, it was the compliance team, the consents team, the policy team. So I have to just acknowledge their marking on this as well.
George, if these things sort of come up in these questions, we'll give you the comments at the end on them all, but just highlight what you've just said. The time frame on this has been compressed. Normally we would run a session where elected members could have an opportunity to think about how this would be drafted and, where your interests lie, to be able to actually work with George on these things because of the nature of the last, 6 weeks to be able to pull this together. That just hasn't been possible. So today there's that opportunity, although we're not going to get into redrafting the submission. Next is Grant.
That was a bit unfortunate, George, because I was giving you all the credit for that. So if you would pass on our regards to the team, because I as well thought it was a well-written submission and it covered most of the points, all the points. I guess taking apart what Sophie said as well, I think it leads back to unfunded mandates, and particularly you identified the 350 million and 43 million annually over the potential, which is probably selling it short, I'd imagine, given the resources that are going to be required. And it really speaks to how out of step the government is in progressing its legislation, because the future of local government should come first. Because bit by bit, the reforms that are going on are dismantling local government before it's been decided what the future for local government is. Take away 3 orders, you take away the planning. I'm particularly concerned by regional planning committees. Using a Ralston example, would we have had iZone with a regional planning committee? Would that be in Hornby? Where would it be? I'm not sure that those things which have been beneficial for our communities about employment and the ability to have local industry locally would be approved by a regional planning committee, where it's planning by committee by nature. So concerned about that, and particularly I'm in line with Sophie about at the moment it's a cost recovery model, but if it's not, the ratepayers are going to pick up the tab, and our ratepayers are already perceived that our rates are too dear already. So really pleased with what you've done, and there's no questions there. It's more about saying good work what you've picked up, but those are the points particularly I'm concerned about that, like Elizabeth, don't align with our council.
That's right, Deborah.
I'd just like to concur with Grant on what he's actually tried to say, and what you were trying to say. And basically this, to me, is another poorly written piece of legislation that shows that from a policy perspective, is there full understanding of what actually happens within territorial authorities and the RMA process as it currently stands. Improvements needed, but when you throw the baby out with the bathwater, that can actually be a very, very costly exercise. And the reality is, if you end up with the equivalent of 15 unitary authorities trying to streamline a process, where is that going to leave the future for local government? Or is that the intention? But instead of being upfront, it's trying to get it through the back door. And so I'm so pleased that we will actually have an opportunity to talk about this in our submission on behalf of our community. But it would have been also nice to be able to have community feedback on how they feel about the representation at the governance level. So, but thanks very much for the team and for the submission. And reading it, it just highlights, just another sad piece of legislation coming out of the centralisation model from from government with a lack of understanding of what actually happens at the ground. Thank you.
Thanks, Deborah. Phil.
Yeah, just picking up on what Deborah said, I'd like to add some weight behind it as well. The community side, your paragraph 6 here, you talk about the lack of time. It's great. I wonder whether we should be a bit more punchy. Just saying, you know, we haven't had any time to talk about with our communities about this. And, you know, that seems to be the way the central government is just doing that now, and we should be punching it whenever we can. My question is a bit more similar. Notwithstanding that court action and case law is going to hone this legislation down and interpret it, well, in your mind, being an expert on it, and I have read them both side by side, and I'm as far away from an expert as I think I can imagine now after having read them both. Will this give us the council more ability to contribute to planning our places?
Thank you for that, Phil. We'll come back to George at the very end. If any other questions, nothing more from people. George, there are a number of things raised there. Do you like to make some comments?
Yeah, I'll start with Phil's question. I'll try to work back. I have to remind me if I forget anything. I appreciate the comments from the elected members on the whole. Very helpful. And, you know, if there are small changes in the timeframe that we got to make those amendments, we'd really like to do that and make sure that your voice is in the submission. Do I think, in my expertise being quite a young planner and not under this system for too long, think it will improve how we plan for our local places? I don't think so, because internationally we've seen regionalisation of planning systems. And the key thing that's come out of that, and why they've reneged on it and gone back to localism, is that it's too disenfranchising for local people, local voice, and the nuances of area to area, place to place. And I think that a regional model might offer some benefits in terms of where there's jurisdictional overlap in the resource management system, like earthworks, different earthworks from Environment Canterbury and then at the territorial authority level, but it does potentially miss some of the nuanced local placemaking planning. Being plans at this level, you have to engage at the Canterbury Regional Plan and the Canterbury Regional Spatial Strategy, and that's quite far removed from local communities, in my opinion. But I can definitely see some potential that it will improve local places. I think a part of the submission is trying to strengthen the statements of community outcomes and the statement of regional environmental outcomes, which I see as the key input mechanism from local government. And we really want to strengthen the language as to how they're considered, and also the remit and how broad they can be as well, seeing them as local place plans. I hope that's answered the question.
Well, there were a number of other things that were raised there. I wonder whether just there could be something at the very beginning of the submission that captures some of the things that have been shared, so we can talk about how we feel that the reform process has been too rushed, and submission timeframes show just how quickly, or how unsatisfactory the timeline is. That we would like to see things done well, and the timeframes don't allow that to happen. That we believe that the future for local government work should have happened first, and then that would actually allow boundaries to be set rather than overlapping boundaries through multiple reform programs. And that overall, while we support the objectives of reform, we don't believe that the legislation as drafted will meet those objectives. And then that sort of just gives a broad overview of the general feeling of the room that we've had here today, and then we can start into the detail that you've provided. Councillors, with that, give you comfort in the discussion that we've had been captured? So at the moment, we can just have, we received the report, we endorse the attached submission, including the conversation today. So George, that just gives George the latitude to work with the words, because I might not have articulated them clearly then.
Sorry, that needs to be in the resolution itself.
Yeah, there we go. So endorses the attached submission, including the conversation at today's meeting.
Fine.
and Built Environment Bill and the Spatial Planning Bill, and delegates the strategy planner to lodge the submission. One other thing the submission's missing is that we would request to speak to the select committee in support of the submission, which just needs to be added as well.
I'm quite happy to move that.
Thank you, Deborah. And a seconder. Oh, thank you. All those in favour say aye.
Aye.
Anyone against? Declare carried. Thanks, George. Next we have private plan change 81 and 82. Just before the three of you leave the room, we'll just check. This is item, this is these plan changes. Then we have plan change 77. Your conflict is also for that, and you'll stay out of the room for that. And then the next one is new designation for educational purposes, which has overlap to the district plan. And just want to clarify whether you want to be brought back into the room for that or whether you would like to stay out.
Maybe stay out.
I'll leave the three of you out and we'll bring you back in for the designation conditions for the required commercial vehicle. Yes. Do we like to go back into that, Nicole and Deborah? The designation to the required commercial vehicle safety centre. Bring you back into the register of documents signed and sealed. Okay. So let's just jump back to item step 12, page 98, plan change 81 and 82, rezoning of land in Rolleston. A, that we received the report, adopt the recommendations of the Commissioner, approve the public notification of the decision and delegates to the Head of Strategy and Policy to take any steps necessary to give effect to it. Jocelyn, welcome.
Thank you. Good afternoon. As is our custom, I can give you a bit of a background or we can take as read and move on.
Yes,
background. Okay. Plan change 81 is a private plan change initiated by Rolleston Industrial Developments Limited for 28 hectares on the corner of Duns Crossing Road and Selwyn Road. Plan change 82 is a separate plan change initiated by Brookside Road Residential Limited for an area of 109 hectares on the southwest corner of Duns Crossing Road and Brookside Road, extending west towards Edwards Road. The two plan changes are in the same location, and the proponent of the two plan changes, as the process occurred, became the same proponent, although different company names. For that reason, the plan changes have progressed side by side along through the process. Both plan changes sought to rezone the land, which is currently zoned rural outer plains, to residential, with a new zone living ND, which was a reflection of the need to incorporate into these plan changes the medium density residential standards promoted by the government through the Enabling Housing Supply and Other Matters Amendment Act to the RMA, Resource Management Act. They went through the process together, and in September this year last year we had a hearing that concluded on the 5th of December. Commissioner Paul Thomas, an independent commissioner, held the hearing and considered the submissions, and he's made a recommendation on both plan changes. The recommendation on those plan changes is that they both be declined. The reasons that the commissioner has included in for that recommendation is that at this time he did not consider that these plan changes would assist council in achieving the integrated management or the effects of use, development, protection of land, associated natural and physical resources of the district, essentially using the language there of the Resource Management Act to suggest that these plan changes at this time aren't suitable for the purposes of the Act. He considered the National Policy Statement on Urban Development, which you may recall was the gateway that opened the pathway through to the numerous plan changes we've had of late. And he concluded there that at this time they are not integrated with infrastructure planning or funding decisions, and won't achieve, in his words, a well-functioning urban environment. And in that context, he did note that his view of a well-functioning environment was not the same as what is conveyed in the National Policy Statement on Urban Development, but still the idea that urban environments should be well-functioning. He also considered that at the time, given the life of the operative district plan, that there wasn't a need to facilitate the capacity that these two plan changes would put forward, that he considered that there was sufficient land available within Rolleston, within what is enabled at the moment to see us through the next 6 to 7 years, and that perhaps a more appropriate process would be through the proposed plan change process, where things could be considered in a longer time frame than what the life of the operative district plan is. He made some recommendations or some observations on the impact that these plan changes might have on our infrastructure down at the Resource Recovery Park and the wastewater treatment plant. And based on the evidence that he heard from the various experts, concluded that if they were in the future to be granted, that 1,000 metre setback or building setback was appropriate from our facilities there, and that land within that setback should be retained as a rural zoning as opposed to being rezoned residential and then having a provision in it that was for a no build area. The Commissioner's overall conclusion is in his report there at pages 247 to 256, and the recommendations for the Council are on the front of the agenda as Sam read out at the start. The recommendation to the Council is to accept the recommendation of the Commissioner and decline plan changes 81 and 82.
Thank you for that. Right, Sophie, seconded. Lydia, thank you. Any discussion? Grant.
Just want to be clear, you spoke of the 1,000 metre setback and the recommendation of the Commissioner. Is that going to be, are you asking us to pass that somewhere into policy, or is it, how is that recommendation from the Commissioner going to be addressed? It's not in the appendix, is it, as a recommendation?
No, it's not in the, because the Commissioner is recommending that the plan changes be declined, there is no need for the setback. It was an observation that he made that based on the evidence that rather than the 600 as proposed, his view was that 1,000 metres was more appropriate. So it's information sitting on the table, I suppose. Should things progress down different tracks in the future and different avenues, the Commissioner's recommendation there is that 1,000 metres, based on what he heard, was appropriate.
One of the concerns I raise is just using the comparable I raised this morning with the asset manager water, which is Murray England, I suppose, is the view, if you use Royden Quarry as an example, the setbacks are internal from the legal boundary, whereas we're asking for a setback in effect, which is external over private land. So I guess the risk to us is if that we did have an internal setback, well, suddenly our capacity on our sewage disposal would be severely limited. So if there is a recommendation or a policy required to be put in place now, I'd suggest that we do follow that up around our key infrastructure so that it does become quite clear in the future to developers that this area is protected. I've got a few more questions. If that's okay. One of the key issues that seemed to be raised in the report was around capacity in Rolleston, and he aligned it with the length of life of the ODP, the 12 to 18 months of the life of it. One of the things that's worried us here as a council for a long time is having adequate supply for when we know demand has always exceeded our projections for a long time. I'm just concerned the Commissioner, in a desire to apply this to the ODP, has applied a very narrow focus, because when you look at the numbers he's put there around existing supply, he's included plan changes 81 and 82 in the supply. So if you take the supply number, this 81 and 82 off the supply numbers, it takes about nearly 2,000 sections off the 6,000 sections potentially available. So really it's about 4,000 sections potentially available for the next 6 to 7 years is the way I read it. I may have it wrong. I'm open to being corrected, but that's the way it reads in the report to me.
The proponent and council worked together on the preparation of a capacity memo at the request of the Commissioner through the hearings process.
Yeah.
I don't have that with me, but it is available on the plan change webpage. We'll pull that up and clarify it.
The way it reads, it's in the report. It does read that 81 or 82 are included in that capacity analysis.
My understanding was that we specifically excluded them, was what was available in Rolleston
Yeah,
in Rolleston now.
we're just, if you could just let me know, because the numbers seem suspiciously similar, both around that 6,000 mark.
Yeah, we worked together. We had slightly different methodologies, but we worked together at the request of the Commissioner to come up with an agreed position. And where we got to was we're not that far off. We're a couple of hundred houses difference depending on the way you calculate areas. But we agreed there that it was around 6,500 houses remained, or there was potential for 6,500 sites within the remaining area of Rolleston. And my recollection is that excluded 81 and 82. But it included the land that we were proposing through the variation, the private plan change requests, that 71, the FUDA, the HESHA, the COVID fast track, all those areas where there was a certainty of this is the intended future for residential.
Yeah, I think I was referring to the evidence of Mr. Sellers, I think, from the applicant, and the numbers that he had around that 6,000 seem to be similar to the numbers that you came up, SANS 81 and 82. So just, I'd be interested in finding that. And that's the last point. You mentioned the Commissioner said a well-functioning urban environment. His view was different from the MPS UD, was it legislation? That sounded a bit out of context, that he would have his own personal view rather than following legislation.
The MPS UD refers to a well-functioning urban environment and sets a framework. It's the national policy statement rather than a piece of legislation. And it's because it's a policy statement, it's one of those that aren't very precise. The Commissioner, my interpretation of what he wrote was that it's had regard to it. We all want a well-functioning environment, but he was taking it in the sense of good urban design, good integration with infrastructure, with transport, with the existing residential or urban development of Rolleston, which was somewhat potentially broader than what the definition was. So aligned, but just a little nuanced, perhaps.
Thank you for your responses. Thank you.
No, my point was Grant's last point, sorry.
Thank you, Jocelyn. It's been moved and seconded. No further questions. All those in favour say aye. Anyone against? Declare it carries. Thank you. The next item is plan change 77, West Melbourne. Welcome, Rachel. Rachel, if you'd like to just give us a brief overview and then
Good afternoon. So at the other end of the process to plan changes 80 and 81, we have a private plan change request 77 at West Melton from Marama to Wai. This plan change request was lodged in December 2020, but now looks quite a bit different from that which was originally lodged, and is now at a point where staff are satisfied that we have sufficient information to be able to go out to our community and ask for their thoughts. The trick, of course, is that given the time that these processes take, it's getting very fine as to whether we're actually going to get a recommendation from the Commissioner on Plan Change 77 before you receive the recommendations from the hearings panel about the proposed district plan, which will supersede Plan Change 77 should it be approved.
yeah, thank you for that context. Do we have a mover and seconder? Bill, thank you. Seconded, Elizabeth. Any discussion? All those in favour say aye. Oh, sorry.
Well, let's, you've raised Rachel. I would say there's zero chance of this getting here before the Commissioner's hearings. And why are we putting a proponent through this process? It appears the outcome is foregone, that we won't have it processed in time. It just seems a waste of resources and energy. And reading the report, it almost appeared that you're asking us to say no. It may not be the current you're trying to say, but can't we be practical here? Is there a solution here that we tell them to defer? Because it does seem, what is the end game here? If we can't do it in time, let's be honest about it and say it's highly I would say it's almost a lay down misère, it won't be done in time.
We have had numerous conversations with the proponents' agents around the likelihood of getting a decision that they're after, or a decision of any type in the timeframe that they're after. We're still here. The threshold for being able to decline a plan change on the basis of unsound resource management practice is very, very, very high. And that's why the recommendation is at this point to continue, remembering, of course, that it is still their dime. There is no impact on ratepayers for us to continue this process because it is completely cost recovered to the proponent.
Would you take a short moment just to explain to me what the alternative is for these people? Would they wait and go into the new proposed district plan? What's the alternative to the solution that currently?
They do have submissions in on the proposed plan as well. So basically at the minute,
double down, have a crack twice.
Exactly. Yeah.
As long as they're paying the costs.
Exactly.
It seems to be less anymore.
There's very little room to move. There's no RMA process. The applicant wants us to follow that process. There's, as you said, Rachel, very little room to be able to say decline. So we've got what we've got in front of us, and they're fully aware of the facts as you presented them to us today, following multiple discussions. We have a mover and seconder for this. All those in favour say aye. Anyone against? Declare it carries. Are you against, right? Yep, I have that noted. That's carries. Next item, thank you, is the new designation for education purposes, Rolleston Secondary School.
So, can I just clarify something?
Yes.
You carried that last motion. What's our quorum? And I just want to clarify.
Half of our members is our quorum.
So
11 of us, so we need 6 in the room.
And only 5 of us voted for that. So it's only 50% of people in the room.
No, we just need 50% or 50% plus 1 if there's an odd number in the room for the meeting to continue, and any voting is only by those members in the room.
And then it's a simple majority.
Yes.
Of the people.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Good. So, new designation for educational purposes. Rachel.
So this one is a new designation that we have received notice of requirement from the Ministry of Education for the new secondary school in Rolleston. The process, just a wee bit of process education. Council is not the decision maker. Where Council is not the requiring authority. In this case, the Council is being asked to make a recommendation to the Minister of Education, and the Minister will be the one who makes the final decision.
Great, thank you. And the decision's here in front of us. Right. Move, seconded. Sophie, you'd like to say something, Sophie?
Yeah, just like to say that I'm very excited to see this being built, because the place is already overflowing. And it was probably needed 2 years ago, but we all know that. And there are other high schools that also need extra capacity. So yay that they're moving on stuff, and may they continue to move on more stuff too.
When will be the opportunity for us, it's very in the process, to talk about community infrastructure within that new high school?
Yes. I'll get Denise to comment on that. I think that discussions of
we have had some preliminary conversations with the Rolleston College. It would be fair to say that our ability to influence some of those conversations is limited. And so we are progressing with having a conversation more directly with the Ministry of Education, because there are opportunities presented by any of the Ministry of Education builds across the district to do that in a more collaborative way, so that there's some joint planning.
So if it's a PPP, as the existing building is, it hasn't.
I don't think it is.
Okay.
No. Mover and seconder, we've gone through any further discussion. All those in favour say aye. Anyone against? Declare it carried. Thank you, Rachel. Next one is amendment to designation condition for the Rakaia Commercial Vehicle Safety Centre.
So this one is an amendment to the existing designation for the Weybridge Centre. As originally designated, NZTA were planning to have both northbound and southbound lanes serviced by the same centre. They have since rethought the value of having trucks crossing the state highway in order to enter or exit site. So they have shrunk this site so that it will service southbound traffic only. And then in due course, they will come in with another notice of requirement for a separate northbound site when they've figured out exactly where and when and how they want to do it.
Thank you. Mover and seconder. Lydia, thank you. Seconder, Paul. Any discussion? Phil.
Again, I guess this is another case where we've been asked by an agency, we're not the final decision makers, but Kotahi decides what they want to put on the site.
That's correct, yeah.
So we don't debate the merits of the site or anything?
This is an existing site.
Oh, yeah, no, I haven't.
So it's just a tweak. But yes, we are limited again to making recommendations to the minister, and the minister makes the final call.
Thank you. All those in favour say aye. Anyone against? Declare it carries. Thank you, Rachel, for those reports. And we'll just ask those that have left the room to come back in. I would say we missed the three of you, and I will because we did. Yeah. Register of documents signed and sealed. It's on page 356 of today's agenda. Mover and seconder. Malcolm, seconded. Lydia, any discussion on these?
Yeah, what is this?
Say this.
Statutory requirement to register certain documents where leases on council property. Yeah. Thank you.
Any further questions? All those in favour say aye.
Aye.
Anyone against? Declare it carried. Resolution to exclude the public. Moved Nicole, seconded Malcolm. All those in favour say aye. Anyone against? Declare it carried. Thank you for joining today's meeting. The public part of the meeting is now closed. And if we just stay in our seats and we'll stop the live stream and give ourselves a couple of minutes.